Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. You're going to have to excuse my voice a little bit for this episode. I've got a very nasty head cold. I've just returned from the Blue Mountains where I've been involved in a few researching projects, and I've returned from the blood bank as well. And somewhere along the line, I've picked up this nasty head cold. Australia, of course, the southern hemisphere, is in the beginnings of our month season of winter. So it is very cold. It's actually, I think, just started to sleet and maybe even snow a little bit outside where I live in the southern highlands of New South Wales, about a 3-hour drive south of Sydney. So there you go. I'm in winter and my voice sounds it, doesn't it? Today, I would like to look at these two very moving, very powerful books underneath the umbrella title of Who Does Suicide Harm? The first book I'm going to look at is this one by Katherine Rundell, that wonderful English John Donne scholar who's just recently completed a PhD, an Oxbridge PhD on John Donne. And this book, Super Infinite, is, if you like, a synopsis, a summary of her Oxbridge PhD thesis. And it is a marvellous biography of John Donne, really bringing to light a very human portrait of that fantastic, Renaissance poet and, of course, the celebrity preacher of St. Paul's. So this is a marvellous book. This is the first book I am going to look at. The second book is this one by the English classicist Edith Hall. Edith Hall specialises, I think, in a reading of ancient Greek drama, in particular tragedy. But she's recently written this very, very moving and powerful book called Facing Down the Furies, Suicide, the Ancient Greeks and Me. This is a marvellous book, very, very moving. It's had a huge impact on me. Hence, I really wanted to bring these two books together for a video. So to begin with the beautiful Katherine Rundell, the biography of John Donne, Super Infinite, or The Transformations of John Donne. Katherine Rundell, as well as being now a very famous Donne scholar, she is also a really interesting UK YA fantasy writer. And I love her fantasy stuff as well. But this is her big debut, if you like, into the world of adult writing. And this is a marvellous biography of John Donne. It really is very, very impactful. The Katherine Rundell book, it begins with an essay, a secret essay that John Donne wrote, an essay, a sermon, and it just secretly was passed around through a very small circle of John Donne friends. In John Donne's day, in that Elizabethan period, suicide, of course, was illegal. And ironically, the sentence for someone who was trying to suicide was in fact death. Suicides themselves, once their body was discovered, were buried at crossroads with a stake through the heart to keep the body suppressed in the ground so that that restless spirit couldn't return and come back again. Very, very sad stuff. So John Donne, he had a long history, personal history with depression, I think, and mental health collapse. He certainly lived with PTSD. So he wrote this essay called Biathanatos. And in Biathanatos, in Greek, that means violent death. And he wrote this sermon or essay, as I said, that was just secretly passed around by a small group of friends. The essay itself was never published until after Donne's death. It was that dangerous to be having your name to a document like this. And he wrote this document, according to Katherine Rundell, he wrote this document in a very run-down, ramshackling old mansion of a house. It was a cold house above a noxious cellar that leaked raw vapours. And in this atmosphere, John Donne wrote this essay in defense of suicide, because for John Donne, we did have the right to pass away by suicide, which is what, of course, would have made this essay so dangerous if it ever had have come to light and people had have realized, authorities realized, that John Donne was the author of it. The celebrity preacher of St. Paul's would certainly have been sacked and quite possibly would have ended up in prison for writing this essay in defense of suicide. John Donne, of course, himself, as Katherine Rundell writes in this beautiful biography, he had so many transformations from, the rake Jack Donne to Dr. Donne, the wise celebrity preacher. He was known as a young man as this author of all this sexed up poetry, this lavishly sexed poetry that he was so famous for. Some marvelous dramatic poetry. So he really was, as a young man, he was known as Jack Donne, the rake. Whether he ever actually was promiscuous and slept around, we don't know. Quite possibly not. He met his wife, Anne, and was apparently besotted with her till the end of his life. When she passed away in childbirth, he certainly never remarried. It's really interesting. But for John Donne, humans are a miracle, but they are also a catastrophe. John Donne really did have these really extreme views about human psychology, about what it was to be human. And of course, he lived in an era, as I just said, where there was so much religious persecution after that horrific English Reformation under, the fat king, Henry VIII. In that cruel, terrible English Reformation, to be found to be harbouring a Catholic priest, simply giving another human being safety and comfort. You were put straight into prison. And one of John Donne's brothers was in fact imprisoned for harbouring a Catholic priest. And the prison conditions were so bad, and so close to plague and outbreaks of Black Death that, of course, his brother, within 6 months, had died in the jail. It really was a death sentence to be sentenced to this sort of thing. And the only thing that John Donne's brother had done was to harbour a Catholic priest, because John Donne grew up in a very devout Catholic home. There were more than a dozen people in John Donne's family who died either in exile or in prison for their faith. He had a couple of uncles and a couple of people in his family were actually executed by beheading for being Catholic and by refusing to take part in the English Reformation against the Catholic Church. It would have been a horrific time to be involved with. So John Donne knew much PTSD, this religious persecution, before he himself converted to Anglicanism and became, as I said, this great celebrity preacher as the Dean of St. Paul's. But he knew so much PTSD from religious persecution, from that wave after wave of Black Death as the plague swept not only through Europe, but of course also through the United Kingdom. He lost so many family members in terrible circumstances. He had a large family with many children born, most of whom, of course, did not make it to anywhere near their teenage years or adult years. Most of his children died very young. He just knew, grief after grief. It was a terrible, difficult, fractious time to be alive. But for John Donne, despite all of that, for John Donne, it was an astonishment to be alive. And it behoves us to be astonished. John Donne was this ecstatic visionary. He was just in love with being alive, with the senses, with taking part in everything that life had to offer. And of course, he wrote about this so dramatically in his poetry and in his St. Paul's sermons. It's just marvelous, marvelous writing. And for John Donne, true sex is the soul played out in flesh. Oh, that takes us right back, doesn't it, to the Hebrew Bible and that wonderful book, the Song of Songs, which is my favorite book in the Bible. The Song of Songs, what a marvelous celebration of human sexuality. And for John Donne, true sex is the soul played out in flesh. Oh boy, what an insight. And John Donne certainly captured that ethos in his poetry, didn't he? His poetry is just fantastic. The poetry that knows so much, excessive hunger and longing, desire and even bawdy lusting. But he also knew dread, the opposites of ravishment and love. And really for John Donne, the opposite of love, of lustful love even, desire, was, of course, dread. And he spent much time on his knees in dread, begging God for mercy. And Katherine Rundell really captures this beautiful human portrait of John Donne in this book. Dr. Johnson, because the 18th century, of course, they hated the metaphysical poets. We've rediscovered them through people like, for example, T.S. Eliot, the great champion of the metaphysicals. But in the 18th century, under Dr. Johnson and people, they hated this school of poetry that, to our 20th and 21st century ear, it just was so dramatic, and we really respond to metaphysical poetry. But for Dr. Johnson, he judged Donne as improper, ugly, and broken. I can't believe it, can you, that somebody could write off the poetry of this master poet with such descriptions. How can you write off all that poetry as improper, ugly, and broken? It is breathtaking. Dr. Johnston, you have to love him just because of the boldness of his pronouncements, I guess. But Donne himself, he was tall and dark and handsome with that exemplary moustache. Not a beard, of course, just the very sexy moustache. John Donne, the young rake, who became so infamous for that poetry. Oh my goodness. But yes, in this essay, I think I might go straight to it. The essay, Biathanatos, Greek for violent death. For John Donne, one of the things he meditates on in this essay is, of course, the passion and martyrdom, Christian martyrdom, which he sees as examples of self-willed death. And, he sees, therefore, the ban on our right to pass away by suicide. He sees that as a hypocrisy, because the Christian message, the Christian story, is built on the passion of Christ. And for John Donne, one way of looking at the passion was as an example of Christ going to his death willingly. In other words, it is Christ, yes, Christ sacrificed himself for us, but it was an example of self-willed death. And John Donne really saw all Christian martyrdom in this context of self-willed death. And therefore, he asked the question, was it hypocritical of the church to so esteem the martyrs, but have this terrible ban on suicide, and even asking the question about whether we have the right to pass away by suicide. And for John Donne, we didn't only have the example of the martyrs and of the passion, but for John Donne, it was within our rights to pass away by suicide if, we live with unbearable misery, heartache, suffering, humiliation. If we live with unbearable humiliation and suffering, heartache, we did have the right to pass away by suicide. It was a choice, for John Donne at least, that was within our rights. So John Donne, as Katherine Rundell highlights in this book, he really defended our right to pass away by suicide. In this book, however, by Edith Hall, the English classicist, this is a really, really powerful book. Very, very deeply moving. In Edith Hall's family, there is a long history going back through the generations of suicide. And so Edith Hall has really grown up and lived with the trauma, the transgenerational trauma, the inherited trauma of suicide. So when she came to write this book, half the book is a philosophical, theological meditation on suicide, if you like, starting with Aristotle's question, who does suicide harm? And for Aristotle and Edith Hall, of course, suicide always harms someone. But in this book, on the other half of the book, Edith Hall is really recounting the story of her own family struggles with suicide. Her own depression and illness when she was a young adult. And then she really recreates for you, retells the actual suicide of a grandmother and a great-grandfather. And it's very, very moving book. Very moving. But she looks at all of this through the prism of Aristotle and of ancient Greek tragedy. It's a remarkable book. So Edith Hall, she begins, as I said, with Aristotle's question, who does suicide harm? But she also goes to that great Jewish theological thinker, Moses Maimonides, and who wrote, of course, he who destroys himself destroys the world. Oh boy, what a way of looking at suicide and the cost of suicide. He who destroys himself destroys the world. Oh, it's a remarkable insight, I think, isn't it? And so she continues on in this book, really looking at this berserk violence, other examples of this very woeful private history. And as I said, for Edith Hall, starting with Aristotle's question, who does suicide harm? For Aristotle and for Edith Hall, suicide always harms someone, family, colleagues, friends, first responders, bystanders, copycats. In answer to Aristotle's question, who does suicide harm? For Edith Hall, always someone. So for Edith Hall, yes, we have the right. She agrees with John Donne. We have the right as individuals in isolation. We have the right to choose life or death. We have the right to pass away by suicide. But Edith Hall would counter that with, we do not have the right to harm others. And for Edith Hall, as for Aristotle, who does suicide harm? Well, always someone, even if it is first responders, onlookers, but of course also copycats, family, friends, colleagues. There's always going to be someone hurt by our suicide. And while we may have the right to pass away by suicide, we do not have the right to harm others. So for Edith Hall, in this really moving, beautiful book, Edith Hall is really arguing, contributing, if you like, to the philosophical discussion, meditation on suicide. But for Edith Hall, she wants to argue against our right to pass away by suicide. For Edith Hall, we do not have the right to pass away by suicide because that action will always harm someone. And we do not have the right to harm other people. It's a very, 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 I think, moving book. She really looks at the history of suicide as it's been reflected on by philosophers as well. And she goes right back, for example, not only to to Aristotle, as I said, to the Stoics, the Epicureans, but she also goes to that great Scottish philosopher David Hume, the great empiricist who wrote his own essay of suicide. And David Hume, who was a complete empiricist, as I said, he was insistent that we abolish superstition from all these arguments. So he argued very strongly that life, there was no such thing as the sanctity of life. Life was worthy for Hume, but it was not sacred. And for David Hume, he argued very strongly that we do have the right to pass away by suicide. He saw this as restoring, in fact, our native liberty. And then moving on forwards from David Hume, Nietzsche, who Edith Hall really discusses at length in this book. Nietzsche wrote at length on suicide, didn't he? Really, again, seeing suicide as an assertion of freedom and sovereign individuality by supra-moral, autonomous individuals. Nobody can speak so grandly on these sort of matters as Nietzsche, can he? Sometimes his language gets away from him a little bit, I think. So Nietzsche called suicide a voluntary death. And as I said, he saw that as completely within our rights. So for Nietzsche, suicide was an affirmation of will and selfhood. And Sartre, he also seemed to agree with Nietzsche. He also defended suicide as an assertion of our choice in the face of alienation, isolation, and absurdity. So Nietzsche also defended our right to pass away by suicide, as I think did Simone de Beauvoir. But of course, the other great contemporary of Nietzsche, of Sartre and de Beauvoir, Albert Camus. Camus, of course, argued strongly against suicide. He argued that suicide was in our right. But for Camus, yes, life was absurd, life was meaningless, but the heroic thing to do, echoing back to the myth of Sisyphus, the heroic thing to do was to look absurdity, meaninglessness in the face, to grit your teeth and bear it and to go on. So for Camus, the great, it was the great philosophical question for Camus. It was the one philosophical question that demanded the philosophers think about and ponder on. But for Camus, yes, we had the right to pass away by suicide, but it was far better, far more heroic, going back to the myth of Sisyphus. It was far more heroic to look meaningless, alienation in the face, to grit your teeth and bear it, and to live on regardless of that. So for Camus, living on was the heroic action. It's fantastic stuff, isn't it? Really, really interesting. And then, of course, in this book, as I said, the whole book is a real meditation on suicide through the lens of ancient Greek tragedy. And of course, as Edith Hall says, Greek tragedy really depicts suffering, the causes and the repercussions of suffering, and the way suffering is passed down through the generations. As Edith Hall says, Greek tragedy is non-judgmental on suicide. It doesn't pass judgment, a moral judgment on whether it's right or wrong to pass away by suicide. It simply looks at suicide as a fact, as a given. It is the way some people chose to end their life. But what Greek tragedy does, and what Edith Hall loves about Greek tragedy, is it really looks at the transgenerational trauma of these actions. It is the first great art form to really look at the personal, the family costs of suicide. Again, Aristotle's question, who does suicide harm? Well, of course, it harms family members, people who love us, who, are going to be really harmed by that action, by that passing away. And of course, suicide also can bring such shame on families, and it shouldn't bring such shame. It should be met with compassion. But of course, often we don't really look at suicides as compassionately as we should. And there is a lot of judgment and stigma to do with it still. So this book by Edith Hall is a beautiful, very moving, very personal meditation on suicide. And for Edith Hall, She loves going back to particularly Aeschylus's play, Agamemnon. And, there is that wonderful refrain that the chorus in Agamemnon cry out throughout the play. That wonderful resonant Greek line that is, sing the song of sorrow, but let good prevail. Oh, what a wonderful insight. Sing the song of sorrow, but let good prevail. Oh, wow. What an incredible therapeutic mantra. Aeschylus gives that wonderful refrain to the chorus to sing out in Agamemnon. It's a marvelous insight, I think. Sing the song of sorrow, but let good prevail. And then, of course, in Euripides, Heracles mad, or Hercules mad, as the Romans would call it, of course. The wonderful Euripides play. Noble people bear calamity. They do not refuse them. And so, noble people don't pass away because they are overwhelmed by calamity. But they, again, like Camus, they grin their teeth and they bear it. They live on. And as Heracles says at the end of that wonderful play by Euripides, man can withstand. I will persevere in living. Oh boy, Euripides, right back the 5th century BC or BCE. What a mantra again, like that incredible mantra from Aeschylus. Sing the song of sorrow, but let good prevail. And Heracles in the Euripides play, he says, man can withstand. I will persevere. Echoing the great Albert Camus. Grit your teeth and bear it. The heroic thing to do is to go on living. I have lived so much of my life with suicidal ideation and, for me, detailed plans for suicide. And I am a suicide survivor. So I have to be careful reading the Edith Hall book because, to be honest, reading this book, it does make me feel a little bit guilty about my past actions and about, so often, having to say no to my own wretched desires to pass away by suicide. It does make me feel a little bit guilty, this book. But at the same time, I think it's a book that I need to read. I need to be careful reading a book like this. Likewise, a lot of the confessional poets that I love so much, John Berryman, Sylvia Plath, all of those, Anne Sexton, Robert Lowell, all of those people, you need to be very careful reading that stuff, looking suicide and suicide ideation too strongly in the face if you are a depressed type person. So I need to be very careful reading this book. Looking at John Donne's beautifully written In Defense of Suicide. So for me, after reading this beautiful book by Katherine Rundell, for me, I really need to finish with this one by Edith Hall. Yes, I have the right to pass away by suicide, but I do not have the right to harm others. My wonderful family, in particular my loving mum, who's already lost her own father when she was, her own father was only 27 when he died from a work accident. Mum was just, as a little girl, was just devastated by that and ended up being actually raised in a children's home because her domestic life became so unstable. And then Mum has, of course, lost both of my brothers 20, 30 years ago. Both of my brothers have passed away in accidents. Mum has just lost so much. She's just crippled with arthritis and asthma, grief-induced asthma and arthritis. So my suicide would so harm my mum, my beautiful mum, my children, my gorgeous little grandchildren. I couldn't do it to them. So yes, maybe I do have the right to pass away by suicide, as Edith Hall, concedes. But As Aristotle would say, who does suicide harm? And the answer to that is always someone. We do not have the right to harm others. I'll leave you on that incredibly poignant note. Thank you for tuning in, and bye for now.